All right, so today we're going deep on something pretty fundamental to tragedy.
Yeah,
Hamartia.
Hamartia.
Now, you've probably heard it called, like the fatal flaw or something like that, right?
Yeah, a tragic flaw, something like that.
But as with so many things, when you really start to look at them,
Mhm.
it's so much more complex than that.
It really is. Yeah.
So let's do a deep dive on this and see if we can really unpack it and come away with a much richer understanding of what this concept really is.
Yeah, I mean, I think like that term tragic flaw is a very sort of like
Yeah.
simplistic way to think about it. And I think if we really want to understand what Aristotle meant by it in the Poetics
Right.
and sort of how that meaning has been sometimes lost
Right.
or at least altered over the centuries,
Hmm.
I think we'll come away with a much more profound understanding of the concept.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's dive right in.
Yeah.
So let's start with the word hamartia itself.
Yeah.
What did Aristotle mean by that?
Well, the word hamartaning
Hmm.
in ancient Greek actually means to miss the mark.
Okay.
And that's a very important image
Okay.
because, for Aristotle, it was not so much about deep-seated moral corruption or a deliberate defiance of the gods or anything like that.
Okay.
It was more about,
Okay.
a mistake or an error,
Okay.
an action that is mistaken.
I see.
It's almost like, if you're an archer and you're aiming at a target,
Hmm.
but you misjudge the wind slightly and the arrow goes astray.
Okay.
Something like that.
So it's not that the person is, inherently
Yeah.
bad.
It's not.
It's that they've made an error in judgment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's often linked to hubris, right?
Yeah.
Hubris is considered a kind of hamartia.
Okay.
But again, hubris for Aristotle was more about an act of overreaching a step too far,
Right.
not just about an arrogant personality.
Right.
Right. And what's really interesting is that Aristotle really focuses on the unintended consequences of the hamartia. He actually defines it as an injury committed in ignorance.
Okay.
The hero sets out to achieve one thing,
Right.
but through some miscalculation or lack of awareness,
Okay.
ends up causing the exact opposite,
Yeah.
often with disastrous results
Right.
that they never intended.
Can you give us like a concrete example so we can really wrap our heads around that?
Yeah, so imagine, a leader
Yeah.
who genuinely believes they're acting to protect their people from a perceived danger,
Okay.
right? But based on incomplete or incorrect information,
Yeah.
right, the actions they take, which are intended to secure safety,
Right.
actually lead to widespread chaos and destruction.
Right. Yeah.
The tragic outcome wasn't their goal. It was an unforeseen result of their flawed understanding or misjudgment of the situation.
Right. So their goal was good, but they just didn't have the right information to act on that goal, and it ended up
Exactly.
backfiring.
Exactly.
So when we hear things like, oh, Oedipus's tragic flaw was his hot-headedness,
Right.
or Othello's was his jealousy, that is really not quite accurate in terms of how Aristotle.
It's not really the way Aristotle would have understood it.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the widespread translation of Hamartia as tragic flaw is largely credited to scholars like A.C. Bradley.
Okay.
But this translation has faced considerable pushback from other thinkers.
Right.
Humphrey House, for one, famously called tragic flaw a tiresome phrase
Okay.
and argued that it doesn't accurately reflect Aristotle's concept.
Okay, so what's wrong with tragic flaw?
Well, Halses and others argue that tragic flaw tends to focus on an inherent moral weakness or personality defect within the character
Right.
that ultimately precipitates their downfall.
Right.
But that clashes with Aristotle's emphasis on an error or mistake that stems from a lack of knowledge or awareness, not necessarily from a flawed moral compass.
Okay.
So
It's not about like, oh, this person was, greedy or whatever, and that caused their downfall.
Exactly.
It's that they made the wrong choice based on
They made a mistake.
information they didn't have.
A mistake of judgment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when people point to like Macbeth's ambition or Samson's sensuality,
Right.
they're not quite hitting the mark there.
They're not really hitting the mark.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Isabel Hyde specifically points to those very examples. She says, Oedipus's hastiness, Samson's sensuality,
Right.
Macbeth's ambition, Othello's jealousy.
Right.
And she says these are often labeled as tragic flaws, but they don't neatly fit Aristotle's definition of hamartia as an error born of ignorance or mistake of judgment.
Okay.
J.L. Moles also highlighted this kind of modern view of Hamartia as primarily an error or mistake of fact arising from a lack of understanding of the circumstances.
Right.
So,
If it's not a character flaw, how should we think about hamartia?
well, think in terms of mistake or error of judgment. I mean, scholars like Bywater and Rostani, whom House references,
Okay.
contend that these are much closer to Aristotle's original meaning. Bywater specifically defined hamartia as a mistake or error of judgment,
Right.
erratum in Latin.
Okay.
That originates not from vice or a corrupt nature, but from a lack of awareness of a crucial piece of information or circumstance.
So this goes right back to what you were saying about unintended consequences.
Exactly.
The hero doesn't mean for disaster to strike.
Yeah, the hero doesn't mean for disaster to strike. And if we connect this to the broader framework of Aristotle's ethics,
Okay.
an error stemming from ignorance is considered non-voluntary,
Okay.
right? So this lack of intent is what makes feelings of forgiveness or pity towards the character possible.
Right.
The focus is on a wrong step, blindly taken, as some have described it, rather than a deliberate act of malice.
Right.
In the ideal tragedy, the downfall isn't due to the hero being inherently evil, but because they simply didn't have all the facts,
Yeah.
making the tragic outcome feel almost inevitable, regardless of their moral character.
Right.
So
So it's not like just one type of error in judgment.
it's not just one type.
It could be any number of things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, scholars have identified several key categories.
Okay.
The first is straightforward ignorance. The character genuinely lacks essential information.
Okay.
Right. Oedipus unknowingly killing his father and marrying his mother is the quintessential example here.
Yeah.
Then there's the hasty or careless view where a character acts impulsively without fully considering the situation and its ramifications.
Right.
This is often illustrated by Othello's snap judgment of Desdemona's fidelity.
Okay.
And then finally, there's a decision taken voluntarily but not deliberately,
Okay.
where the full weight or implications of the action aren't realized at the time.
Okay.
Some interpret the actions of characters like Lear and Hamlet through this lens.
Right.
It's also important to remember that hamartia can certainly coexist with other moral imperfections.
Yeah.
I mean, characters like Oedipus and Macbeth aren't perfect individuals.
Right.
But their tragic downfalls in the Aristotelian sense are triggered by a critical error in judgment.
Okay, so these errors, these moments of hamartia, they don't just exist in isolation. They have
Yeah.
a ripple effect
Yeah, they set off a chain reaction.
that leads to the tragic conclusion.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is where concepts like peripeteia and anagnorisis come into play.
Oh, okay.
Right? Peripeteia refers to a reversal of fortune, often a direct and ironic result of the hamartia.
Okay.
Right? So one or more actions taken in blindness that lead to outcomes completely opposite to what was intended.
Right.
That's the tragic irony unfolding.
Yeah.
And anagnorisis is the moment of recognition, the point at which the hero gains a crucial understanding they previously lacked,
Right.
often about the true nature of their actions or the surrounding circumstances.
Right. So it's like they're, stumbling forward,
Yeah.
unaware of the truth, and then bam, at a pivotal moment,
Yeah, exactly.
the light bulb goes on, but it's already
It's too late.
too late.
Yes, it changed course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
S.H. Butcher argued that Oedipus embodies all these aspects of hamartia and its consequences perfectly.
Both he and Bywater considered Oedipus in the ancient world and Othello in a more modern context
Okay.
as prime examples of noble characters who, despite their good intentions, are led to ruin by actions rooted in ignorance.
Right. So it sounds like this concept of hamartia is, it really embedded in the fabric of Greek tragedy.
Absolutely.
But what happens when we look at more modern plays?
Right.
Has the idea kind of evolved or shifted?
Yeah, it has evolved quite significantly.
Okay.
I mean, in many modern plays, the concept of hamartia in its purest Aristotelian sense often feels less central
Okay.
to the hero's downfall.
Okay.
Instead of the hero being the primary driver of their own destruction through an error in judgment,
Right.
they often become more of a victim of circumstance,
Okay.
almost as if they are caught in forces beyond their control.
So the power dynamic shifts from the individual character to the external
Exactly. Think about it in Greek tragedy. The overarching antagonist was often seen as destiny or fate. In many modern plays, that role tends to be filled by societal pressures,
Right.
economic inequalities, political systems, or other external factors.
Right.
The archetype of the powerful hero, wrestling with inevitable fate, has in many ways been replaced by more ordinary, perhaps more passive modern heroes
Right.
who are often acted upon,
Right.
rather than actively shaping their own destinies.
Right.
Some critics even suggest that the very idea of a towering, heroic figure in tragedy
Right.
is becoming outdated, reflecting a societal shift towards seeing common individuals as more representative of the human condition.
It's a huge shift.
Yeah,
So does Hamartia, as Aristotle originally conceived it, even really apply to many of the tragedies we see on stage today?
that's a very insightful question.
Yeah.
I mean, while the underlying idea of a character playing a role in their own misfortune often persists,
Right.
the specific emphasis on an error of judgment stemming from a lack of personal knowledge rather than being overwhelmed by external forces
Right.
is often less pronounced
Okay.
in modern works.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to some of those other Aristotelian concepts.
Yeah.
How does this idea of hamartia connect with the notion of catharsis?
Right. Well, hamartia is absolutely crucial to achieving catharsis,
Okay.
that emotional release or purging
Yeah.
that Aristotle believed the audience should experience through tragedy.
Right.
He argued that the most effective tragedies utilize reversal peripeteia and recognition anagnorisis
Right. Yeah.
to bring about this catharsis.
Okay.
Oedipus again serves as a powerful example of a hero who undergoes a devastating reversal and achieves a profound self-recognition by accepting his fate.
Right.
This catharsis experienced by the hero then evokes feelings of pity and fear in the audience.
Okay.
Pity for the hero's suffering, and fear that a similar error in judgment with equally dire consequences
Right.
could potentially befall anyone.
So we empathize with their human mistake, and that creates a sense of emotional release in us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hamartia also plays a key role in the very structure of a dramatic work, the setup or complication and the resolution or denouement.
Yeah.
The hero's error in judgment, the hamartia, often sets in motion the rising action, the complication that builds towards the climax of the play.
Right.
The denouement, the unraveling of events, and the tragic outcome then follows as the inevitable consequences of that initial misstep play out.
It really does sound like hamartia is the central engine driving the whole
It is.
mechanism of Aristotelian
Yeah.
tragedy.
And if we consider Aristotle's view of art as fundamentally imitative of life,
Okay.
hamartia fits perfectly within that framework,
Okay.
right? Human beings in the real world frequently make mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
act with incomplete information, and suffer unforeseen and often painful consequences.
Right.
Tragedy, in this sense, mirrors that very human reality.
Yeah.
Aristotle even argued that when evaluating a play, poetic judgment should prioritize the internal consistency and unity of this imitation
Okay.
over strict adherence to factual accuracy.
Okay.
So even if a character's actions aren't historically precise,
Yeah.
if their hamartia and its resulting consequences feel believable and true to life within the context of the play,
Right.
that's what holds the most artistic weight.
Interesting. And he actually drew a comparison between tragedy and epic poetry and ultimately favored tragedy.
Yeah, he did.
Right.
While he acknowledged that epic poetry had its own merits in terms of entertainment and instruction,
Yeah.
Aristotle believed that tragedy was the superior art form, partly due to its more immediate, intense dramatic impact
Yeah.
and its conciseness,
Yeah.
right? The ramifications of that central error, the hamartia, could unfold with concentrated power and be fully experienced by the audience in a single performance.
Yeah.
So,
And this tragic hero himself, as Aristotle defined him, is someone we can connect with precisely because of this capacity for hamartia,
exactly.
this potential for.
Yeah, the tragic hero isn't a flawlessly virtuous individual,
Right.
nor are they irredeemably evil.
Right.
Instead, they possess a frailty or capacity for error.
Yeah.
This hamartia that ultimately leads to their downfall. Right. For the tragedy to resonate with the audience, there needs to be a sense of relatability and understanding that even someone of noble stature
Right.
can make a critical mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And finally, you mentioned the unity of poetry.
Right.
How does that tie in with this idea of hamartia?
Well, Aristotle believed that the most compelling dramatic plots revolve around a central axis,
Yeah.
a core unifying idea
Yeah.
that gives the play coherence and purpose,
Okay.
right? And the hero's hamartia often serves as a critical element of this central idea,
Right.
driving the entire sequence of events and connecting all the seemingly disparate elements of the play into a unified and meaningful whole.
Okay, so to bring all this together, then we've really, moved away from this simpler idea
Yeah.
of hamartia as just a tragic flaw,
Right.
a character defect.
A character defect.
And we've come to a much more nuanced understanding that
Okay.
it's fundamentally an error in judgment,
Exactly.
stemming from ignorance or a hasty, ill-considered decision.
Right. And by grasping this distinction,
Yeah.
you can gain a far richer and more insightful appreciation for tragic literature.
Yeah.
Not just the ancient Greek masterpieces,
Right.
but also many of the tragedies that continue to be written and performed today.
Right. So for you, the listener, as you think about, plays or stories, like, well,
Yeah.
consider this.
Yeah.
Instead of simply chalking up a character's downfall to a flaw in their personality,
Right.
could you analyze it as an error in judgment rooted in a lack of crucial information or a decision made without fully understanding the consequences?
Right. Yeah.
How does that shift in perspective change your understanding of the tragedy and the character's ultimate fate?
Yeah. I mean, it's a concept with layers,
It is. It really is.
that continue to offer
Yeah.
new insights.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me. It's
Yeah.
a pleasure. Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah.